the Northern Belle. Mayday, Mayday. We are at 59 degrees, 10 minutes north, 146, 47 degrees west.
Roger, I understand the vessel name is Northern Belle. Break. Vessel Northern Belle, this is United States Coast Guard, Kodiak, Alaska, communication station on 4125, over.
Yes, Coast Guard, Northern Belle. Go ahead.
Vessel Northern Belle, request to know if you are in need of assistance, over.
Absolutely, we are going down.
Roger, understand you are going down. Request to know persons on board, over.
We have 4 persons on board. We're getting in a life raft here. We're going down.
Vessel Northern Belle, this is Comte Kodiak. Request you say again the persons on board, over.
They have 4 people aboard. That is 4.
Vessel Northern Belle, this is Comte Kodiak. Roger, understand you have 4 persons on board. Request to know description of your vessel, the make, length, and color, over.
Built as kind of a one-off by Blue Streak Industries out of Burlington, Mississippi in 1979, the Northern Belle began its life as the Cortez. Hull number 35, the Cortez was intended for use amongst fishing fleets, but technically designated a utility boat, and, at least once it became the Northern Belle, it was used as a fishing tender vessel. Information is scant on its life previous. Fishing tenders technically are those boats that supply, store, refrigerate, or transport fish, fish products, or materials directly related to fish or fish processing. A single diesel main engine and single screw at 75 feet in length but only 24 feet wide, it was a bit smaller than its counterpart built by Blue Streak in the same era, the Non-C, or as it's known in modern times, the Ruth and Pat, which was purpose-built for fishing. Aside from these 2 vessels, Blue Streak Industries actually specialized in lift boats. Lift boats are a world apart from commercial fishing boats, so the Non-C and Cortez were each kind of a one-off, according to these records at least. Even more unique was the Cortez's, or Northern Belle's, size and configuration as they relate to its intended uses, which we will cover here shortly. These episodes, though without sponsors, are made possible in large part by you, the viewers, subscribers, and especially Immortar supporters. Supporters get advanced notification for live episodes, early access to videos, and more. Links in description, or just click join. This incident took place in the Gulf of Alaska, and if you follow this channel, you may know already the gravity this part of the North Pacific has for both the loss of vessels and thorough investigations that follow. But ever since I created the folder for this project and did some preliminary work to get it started, it was uniquely frustrating. U.S. waters, the Gulf of Alaska, a fishing vessel, Coast Guard involvement, it had all the hallmarks of the typical lessons learned type event that intrigues me. And don't get me wrong, we'll have some recommendations and lessons learned, albeit to a lesser extent though. It's that lesser extent that was the frustrating part. Details on the vessel itself are scant, no NTSB involvement that I can find so far, and even the typical media buzz around an incident like this was much more sparse than I'd typically find. But I eventually realized a connection that just couldn't be ignored, coincidence or otherwise. That's right, the Northern Belle went down on the evening of Tuesday, April the 20th, 2010, the same day the Deepwater Horizon incident kicked off. Now, it's understandable the Deepwater Horizon was an all-hands-on-deck type event, for investigators at least. It was one of those rare events, large enough in the US to justify an entire commission being formed. So, whether a result of this or not, we have another loss of vessel whose lessons went underserved, in my opinion. Just to be clear, there are a number of these incidents that go overlooked, regardless of their timing though, and being overlooked is really one of the themes for today's video, in several ways. The Aleutian Trade Act, as summarized by the U.S. Coast Guard's then Vessel Safety Coordinator of the 17th District, Juneau, Alaska, passed by Congress in 1990 just after the Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Act of 1988, The Aleutian Trade Act was intended to allow those vessels that were carrying cargo to remote Alaskan communities, which at the time of the act were generally well recognized as being largely commercial fishing based, to allow those vessels to continue in service despite being uninspected, while at the same time ensuring that they came into a phased-in period of having to comply to a higher set of safety standards. If you look in 46 CFR Part 28 Subpart G, that part's got a lot of requirements. Nobody ever enforces all of it because it applies to like 20 Aleutian Trade Act boats, but that's the set of regulations that apply to these guys. And these inspections, of course some would argue, still aren't adequate. For example, the use of the Jones Act, in some cases exploitation of it, and the outright abhorrent conditions of the El Faro and its sister ships. The Jones Act is a topic for discussion all on its own, but this is along the same lines. The Aleutian Trade Act, at the same time, allowed for these grandfathered vessels to run these routes well past the point of their prime. Utilizing older hulls isn't itself an issue, but doing so without keeping them up to modern stability and safety standards can lead to all sorts of dangerous situations. Also, as you can imagine, the act wasn't always used, and some would argue wasn't even created in good faith to simply transport items to remote communities in need. Corners were cut and the vessels were known to be used simply as freighters or, in this instance, to act as the common carrier to transport cargo for hire. And it's reported sometimes without even additional pay for the freight because, well, you're headed that way anyhow, aren't you? A bit of foreshadowing. But after all, the remote communities along Bristol Bay need logistical support just like anyone else. It's just, as you can imagine, their economy is heavily dependent on fishing and seafood production in general anyway. While there are many operations who utilize fish tenders over 100 feet in length, it really can vary greatly. The Billiken seen here carrying fish processing equipment or retrieving the haul from other, smaller fishing boats, very much a crabber or cod boat in appearance, like we've seen in previous videos, but also performing fish tendering duties. From an article about the well-known tenders Brenna A and Jennifer A, the tenders anchor in a bay and the fishing boats come to them because it's much easier to unload a boat in the non-rolling waters of the bay, as opposed to the rolling waters of the ocean. Nicknamed the Brenna Jen, they measure in at a much larger 115 by 29.5 feet and 121 by 33 feet, respectively. With its wide-open, long, low stern deck and lacking gear compared to so many of its contemporaries, though, the Northern Belle resembled more of an offshore supply vessel in shape, albeit in near miniature form. This stood out to me. Supply ships, though, differ greatly from fishing vessels in that they are designed for heavy freight hauling, operating far offshore in huge seas and ferrying tons and tons of supplies on their open decks, acting as anchor handling vessels, even acting as tugs when needed. They're the very definition of a utility freighter. The Northern Belle, while technically classed a fishing vessel, was in sort of this gray area between fishing and utility boat, and it was rather unique in its dimensions if you'd have put it side by side with many other vessels performing similar duties. Examples like the Kathleen K at 98 by 26 feet, 2 feet wider in beam, the Perception 92 by 26 feet, the Alaska Chieftain 92 by 29.5 feet, the Gunnell Heights, the increased freeboard, all much more robust and for good reason. In addition to other countless tendering vessels, longliners, combination vessels, seiners, trawlers, gill netters, these boats are workhorses. While there are many configurations of fishing boats, it's more of a technical term for how they're currently set up, and fishing season requires all sorts of multi-purpose uses. The actual registration process for the U.S. Coast Guard breaks it down from commercial fishing vessel into only 3 major subtypes though: the fishing vessel, the fish processing vessel, and the fish tender vessel. Many of these boats carry various loads of fish processing machinery and other materials. It's not always nefarious, and oftentimes these loads are light within the stability calculations of the vessel. And of course, that's not always the case either, and sometimes they're loaded to the gills. But regardless, this speaks to the issue of stability that has come up in so many case studies on this channel, like the urge to stack crab pots higher and higher on the main deck of old crabbers, according to outdated or erroneous stability calculations. Cargo containers reaching heights on an aging, modified trailer ship that it was never originally intended for. Even additional vehicle decking and passenger compartments stacked high on the stern of a ferry. These practices bring the center of gravity up, in some cases drastically, reducing stability. And it's not that the Northern Belle was alone in its weight class at 95 gross tons. It wasn't. There are countless vessels of similar size. It's more like punching above its weight class in some of the tasks it took on might be a more appropriate phrase. While many vessels in these examples, along with so many others in use around the globe, have the ability to carry much of their load below decks, as was intended, in compartments specifically designed for it, the needs to move cargoes that simply can't store below the load line creates a market for those who are willing or able to carry heavy loads far above it. Impromptu freighters, unfortunately, sometimes pressed into use with little regard for stability. A typical fishing vessel is often built with fish pens below decks, designed to take on massive amounts of what acts as nearly liquid cargo, fish. This cargo then acts as ballast. The fish pens below decks aren't there just to keep the catch cool, and it's also why you don't see a vessel's catch out in the open for long, beyond being sorted and processed. This is essentially what makes it possible to carry dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons of fish all the way to port, and all this in a vessel that appears otherwise rather small, compared to many of the hulking vessels seen on the high seas. There's just so much going on in such a relatively small package. Some of these fishing boats just fascinate me. Anyway, taking this into account means the stability margin for overloading is greater when loading below decks, if the vessel is built for this, typical on vessels classed for fishing. Ideally, this keeps the center of gravity within planned tolerances. It's unknown if the Northern Belle even had any sizable cargo holds below decks. This configuration and its dimensions suggest it may not have. Like I said, information on this vessel is scarce. Regardless, utilizing the open main deck to stack cargo means from the very first piece added, you've started raising the center of gravity up, steadily decreasing your margin for stability. And no matter where you put the cargo, it adds weight and reduces a vessel's freeboard. In addition, freeing ports are crucial for rapid clearing of water on any vessel, even more so if a ship's weather deck is so close to the waterline. Water will be getting on deck, and scuppers, essentially drains that lead directly overboard, along with freeing ports, make this possible. But if the hatches leading below decks anywhere along the weather decks aren't watertight, it's then up to the bilge pumps inside to dewater those compartments. And bilge pumps require frequent, skilled maintenance. Even then, when functioning properly, they can still be quickly overwhelmed if watertight hatches aren't doing their job. Which ideally, if the bilge pumps aren't able to keep up, they then sound an alarm in the wheelhouse. If you recall in the case of the Emmy Rose, the lazarette hatch, the hatch to the compartment where the rudder and steering moving parts can be serviced, was the NTSB's primary suspect in the sinking. The consensus amongst authorities being it was either left open or otherwise wasn't watertight, allowing water to fill the stern while the vessel was already heavily loaded. Contracted and loaded by Snopac Products of Seattle, the Northern Belle would get underway on April 10th, using what's known as the Inside Passage, a route that hugs the coastline through Canadian waters and inside the Alexander Archipelago. On board was the captain, a 54-year-old lifelong mariner, and reported owner of the company that owned and operated the Northern Belle and 3 other vessels. There would also be 3 other crew members, the mate, 52 years old, deckhand 1, 36, and deckhand 2, 48, along with the captain's 8-year-old dog, a cocker spaniel named Baxter. Once underway, the group of 4 would take turns at the helm, each in 4-hour shifts, with 8-hour breaks in between. The Inside Passage allows vessels to avoid open waters until roughly Juneau, where they break away from the coast to cross the Gulf of Alaska. The Northern Belle ultimately bound for Dillingham, Alaska, in Bristol Bay, where Snopac Products had recently established their new seafood processing location. Reports vary, but the boat was carrying various construction materials from Seattle to Dillingham. Some reports say steel construction equipment, but others, like the Alaska Daily News in interviews later, a crew member recounting, quote, a load of lumber, pilings, and other construction materials. Clearly not just processing equipment or items directly related to fishing fleet support. Lumber speaks for itself, and pilings are essentially even heavier lumber. Pilings being those large, round, treated wood poles driven into the seabed close to shore for use in docks, piers, and so on. Quite substantial pieces of wood. The crew early on, quote, had suspicions that their vessel may not have been properly loaded. Even the captain reportedly expressed reservations that there was too much weight in the stern. Once offloaded in Dillingham, the plan was to make their way toward a herring fishery off the coast at Kodiak, presumably to perform actual fish tendering duties in the bay. Now, keep in mind, this is a long journey, roughly 2,500 miles, depending on stops and conditions. Nearly 10 days had elapsed just reaching the Gulf of Alaska. After that, the planned route would take them through the treacherous waters along the Aleutian chain, in both directions. Bristol Bay and Dillingham sit just on the chain's northern side, with no other route but to go around if by sea. The Gulf of Alaska, though, is nothing to scoff at either. As the Northern Belle transited the Gulf on Tuesday, April 20th, conditions were reportedly overcast, visibility was good, and seas were about 4 to 6 feet high, which, for the area, was considered relatively calm. Ambient temperatures that day roughly 40 degrees, and water temperatures reportedly in the lower 30s, quite frigid. As the mate recalled, they were low on freeboard when entering the Gulf, due to both the weight of the cargo and fuel they'd taken on. So he'd been fighting a constant battle to keep the engine room pumped out and maintain what little freeboard they had. Despite the ongoing issues and potential overloading, they had made it this far, approximately 400 miles across the Gulf. It was a bit after 5 p.m. and they'd all just finished dinner. The mate would take his shift at the helm and deckhands 1 and 2 would remain off duty. Suddenly the mate noticed through the front windows they were bow up and listing hard to starboard. He immediately called out to the captain, with the intention of having the master take the helm so he, the mate, could go back down to check the engine room for suspected flooding. The captain had already gone down immediately to check on it himself. Once the vessel began its sudden list, the captain did spot Baxter briefly and yelled out to him, but all the commotion scared the dog and he ran away to another part of the boat. As the mate remained at the helm, deckhands 1 and 2 came up from dinner during the sudden chaos, and the mate ordered them to immediately begin helping each other don their survival suits. There was much confusion, and as the captain returned to the wheelhouse, the mate joined the other two in preparing to abandon. During this time, the captain quickly donned his survival suit and then sent that crucial Mayday call which, when made correctly, as this captain did, can give rescue crews exactly what they need to provide assistance as quickly as possible. A Mayday followed immediately by current, accurate, clear coordinates. The captain exited the wheelhouse yelling to everyone that they needed to deploy the life raft and abandon ship. The raft they started struggling with, presumably their only one, was too difficult to get untied at the boat's extreme angle, and it ended up useless. They had to give up on it quickly as the boat was going down fast. With the life raft no longer an option, deckhands 1 and 2 moved toward the more exposed port side to avoid the tangle of gear that was spilling to starboard as the vessel capsized. The captain and the mate decided instead to slide down starboard into the water. Tearing his survival suit in the chaos on the way down, the mate then got stuck underneath the loading crane as the vessel pulled everything down with it. Fighting with all he had, he kicked himself free at the last moment. The captain wasn't as fortunate. When trying to jump in around the same time as the mate, the captain got tangled in a mess of gear and struck his head on what the mate saw was a large metal pump. The captain did have his survival suit on, but didn't resurface right away. All 3 crew members managed to swim clear of the Northern Belle as it disappeared below the waves. Eventually, the mate spotted the captain's survival suit some distance away, floating face down, motionless. They all bobbed around helplessly in the waves for about an hour, with some distance between them, fighting hypothermia and trying to keep their heads out of the water. They'd become separated early on. Suddenly, the mate spotted a patch of lumber still tied together, floating within sight. It took roughly an hour to get to it, but he finally reached it and pulled himself onto the makeshift raft. He turned on his suit's flashing light beacon and repeatedly blew his whistle in an effort to draw the others to him. He couldn't get the lumber raft to move significantly in any direction, but Deckhand 1 successfully made her own way aboard. Deckhand 2 was unable to swim all the way and remained on his own, floating in the waves. As the other 2 held fast to the floating lumber, getting battered by wind and waves, falling off and climbing back on a few times. According to Alaska Daily News, the mate, quote, thought about his 11-year-old daughter to stay motivated. The mother of Deckhand 1, in an interview later, stated, Deckhand 1 told her, while floating at sea, helpless, cold, awaiting rescue underneath the gray overcast sky, that suddenly, quote, the sun came through the clouds and she said, see, it isn't over. But the waves were growing higher as the weather slowly worsened, soon to reach heights of about 12 feet. Hypothermia was setting in. Spray and splashing water were battering frozen, exposed faces. Whether floating out alone or huddled on the soaking raft, it was getting harder to stay warm, harder to stay awake. Racing toward the last known position, the Coast Guard air assets had gotten airborne about 10 minutes after the 5:30 p.m. Mayday call. Taking off from Kodiak Station meant a roughly 220-mile trip to the captain's coordinates, about 51 miles south of Montague Island and 21 miles southwest of Middleton Island, both uninhabited. The rescue crews heading out with the info that there was 4 POB, or 4 persons on board, but no description of their vessel. From Petty Officer Sarah F., one of the Coast Guard crew aboard the C-130. The rescue team had conditions in its favor. Winds were at 35 miles per hour and skies were overcast, but it was daytime. Visibility was excellent and there was no rain. There was a gale warning, but the storm hadn't moved in yet. The captain's call was crucial as there was no locator beacon pinging from the accident site. Being 2010, EPIRBs were expected on fishing vessels, but no one had received any emergency transmissions of that sort. It simply cannot be overstated. Had the captain not made the distress call, and had he not provided such precise positioning, the Coast Guard wouldn't have had any sort of starting point, especially this early on. The C-130 arrived at the coordinates first, roughly 8 p.m., and flying at about 500 feet, right away they noticed some floating lumber and the tangle of fishing gear strewn about on the surface. Once the aircrew located survivors, they circled around and dropped smoke to mark locations and self-inflating life rafts near Deckhand 2, who they noticed was floating on their own, while the other 2 were still visible atop their pile of lumber. All this would make it possible for the Jayhawk helicopter to begin rescue operations immediately. No need to use up time and fuel searching upon arrival. The Coast Guard records show the vessel Muskrat as taking part in some regard. It's unclear whether it was in the area and also proceeding toward the coordinates to assist, or if it was just the vessel who aided in relaying that crucial part of the Northern Belle's distress call. Just a few minutes after the C-130 arrived, marked positions and dropped life rafts. The helicopter had dropped their rescue swimmer and began hoisting operations. Deckhand 2 was able to get himself into one of the life rafts dropped by the C-130 crew. The Jayhawk made the most at-risk, potential survivors their first priority, and upon bringing the first victim into the helo, it was Captain Royer, who was pronounced deceased at the scene. The helo crew quickly moved on to rescue the other 3, the rescue swimmer aiding Deckhand 2 out of the life raft, and they would all be hoisted on board and taken directly to Cordova Medical Clinic for treatment, all 3 of which treated for various stages of severe hypothermia, presumably making full physical recoveries. Their survival suits sent to the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Unit in Valdez to be tested for watertight integrity. The cutter Long Island arrived a bit later and recovered all deployed life rafts. Reports vary, but some say the mate attempted to stash the dog Baxter in his survival suit, while others say Baxter was never seen again after he ran and hid when the chaos started. Either way, Baxter was ultimately presumed lost. Now, amongst the many suspected issues leading up to this incident, the Coast Guard investigation determined the following based on crew statements and vessel history. The high bilge level alarms in the lazarette and engine room areas failed to operate. One of the crew admitted that the lazarette bilge alarm was not checked. On some boats, especially of smaller size like the Northern Belle, this compartment can be difficult to access. The Coast Guard report would go on to say, this early warning signal would have prompted a reaction and possibly alerted the crew to a hazardous situation. The need for true watertight subdivision cannot be overstated. Progressive flooding occurred from the lazarette area forward. From witness statements, we can assume a bulkhead failure related to a lack of maintenance and upkeep that allowed flooding to proceed forward swiftly. This did not give the crew any time to respond or perform damage control once they had ascertained that there were issues. A good percentage of these failures should have been addressed by the vessel owner/master prior to getting underway. With proper Coast Guard oversight, the vessel would not have been able to get underway until issues were addressed and met a minimum requirement. And if indeed the bulkhead they're referring to did crack, it would line up with how they'd made it so far, combined with the list being so sudden. If these bulkheads are rusted and waiting to give way, it's a nightmare scenario once out to sea. In addition, what was made abundantly clear, according to Coast Guard investigators, we know that one of the immersion suit's head flotation would not inflate because of a faulty/broken mouthpiece, and another suit did not properly fit one of the crewmen. At the time of the sinking, he was unable to locate the XL suit he believed had been issued to him. The life raft on the sister vessels of the Northern Belle was installed in a manual release-only configuration. Having interviewed various crew, It is understood that the same person that installed the raft on the sister vessel also did the Northern Belle's install. Therefore, it can be assumed that the life raft was improperly installed on the Northern Belle, disallowing the raft to float free and sever the painter. The painter being part of the linkage that should break away easily on its own, easy enough that should the raft float upward, it would break free, the pod would open, and the raft would self-inflate. All this on top of the fact that no EPIRB had pinged in this whole ordeal. A vessel-attached EPIRB, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, should work on the same premise as the life raft. It can be manually triggered or, once submerged, breaks free from the vessel, floats to the surface, and begins transmitting an automated distress to satellites overhead. The satellites then relay this signal. The advantages are pretty self-explanatory. And the NTSB always recommends personal EPIRBs, one on each individual crew member at sea. It's unclear as to whether the Northern Belle had one equipped and it malfunctioned, or if the vessel wasn't carrying an EPIRB at all. According to the Coast Guard's additional findings and recommendations, one of the contributing factors to the sinking of the FV Northern Belle was the apparent overloading of the vessel with construction materials. The materials were being hauled for the vessel's contracting company. According to crew statements, the vessel was overloaded and lacked sufficient freeboard for the transit. The investigation also revealed that there was no load plan coordinated between the vessel's master and the loading facility. It is believed that the combination of these oversights led to the likelihood of the aft deck becoming awash, thereby exacerbating the flooding of non-watertight compartments. It is recommended that the ACSA program be expanded to include fishing vessels that carry freight. The ACSA program requires a stability analysis from a naval architect, a loading mark amidships, and an addendum listing the vessel's watertight openings and penetrations. The addendum allows the operator and Coast Guard to quickly gauge the material condition of the envelope and identifies which openings must be kept closed. Another added benefit to adding the vessels to the program would be an inspection interval regulated by the Coast Guard, whereas a vessel would be required to be inspected to remain in compliance. Regarding the efforts of the captain in those final moments, the then commander of operations at Air Station Kodiak stated, "To his great credit, he gave a precise position, a starting point for us. His actions, based on everything I've learned, saved his crew. Had he not gone into the cabin and made the distress call, the outcome of this would have been very dire." From Coast Guard District 17's then Vessel Safety Coordinator Ken L., the officer, quote, responsible for all Coast Guard safety efforts for the Alaskan commercial fishing industry. He stated during a Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act committee meeting that took place May 11th, 2010, just a couple weeks after the sinking. On April 20, the Fishing Vessel Northern Belle capsized and sank in the central Gulf of Alaska. If you read any of the media accounts, you know the captain did not survive the sinking, is being hailed as a hero for staying behind and making a Mayday call. It's possible he was killed in egressing the vessel at that point. However, the 3 crew members were saved after 2.5 hours in the water. That vessel's last dockside exam was in June 2004. The lucky dockside examiner is speaking to you now. I had no idea at the time, and I hate it when that happens. It was in Bristol Bay tendering salmon when I took a look at that boat last. Didn't give them a decal, they had some problems, a short work list, and those items apparently were not addressed by the Coast Guard for any follow-up. We believe the vessel was acting in a capacity as a tender, and because I have that in quotes, I'll define that when we talk about cargo for hire. Carrying cargo from Seattle to Dillingham, which is in Bristol Bay, we believe, for one of the fish companies. And that's one of the primary focuses this ongoing investigation is looking into, the exact nature of that voyage. We're trying to factualize the type and amount of cargo loaded on board the Northern Belle and the stability conditions of the vessel. This brings me to the Aleutian Trade Act and cargo for hire. The act passed by Congress in 1990 just after the Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Act of 1988. It was intended to allow those vessels that were carrying cargo to remote Alaskan communities to continue in service despite being uninspected, while at the same time ensuring that they came into a phased-in period of having to comply to a higher set of safety standards. Nobody enforces all of it because it applies to like 20 Aleutian Trade Act boats, because that's the set of regulations that apply to these guys. Congress specifically identified 20 vessels in service at that time, so the act allowed Congress to make the allowance in the law for those vessels to remain grandfathered, bring them up to a higher safety status, and remain in competition with other vessels already in service carrying freight. Congress saw the need to ensure that service to rural, remote Alaskan communities as providing that incentive to allow the tenders to continue without having to come into inspected status. The Aleutian Trade Act area is very specifically defined in regulation. This line at 153 degrees west cuts through the middle of Kodiak Island and goes westward to the end of the Aleutian chain. So that was the area those vessels were envisioned being able to remain in service. A service they'd been in for some cases decades, competing with larger vessels from Sealand and APL and some of the larger transportation companies. Nothing is ever easy, and this issue is not cut and dry. As defined in the regulations, a fish tender vessel, and I think about 98% of the tenders out there are operating in the 17th District, as defined by the regulations, is a vessel that commercially supplies, stores, refrigerates, or moves fish, fish products, or materials directly related to fishing or the preparation of fish to or from a fishing, fish processor, or fish tender vessel, or a fish processing facility on shore. So it's this general grab bag which says you are a fishing industry vessel as long as what you're doing is related to commercial fishing. Now, even in researching the vessel's history like I normally do, it's like this thing was a ghost. It appears to have flown under the radar of registration for so long. It's not exactly rare. The sheer volume of vessels out there, both past and present, means these things do happen, and not always with ill intent. But then, when an incident like this transpires, it leads to investigation. Just the nature of the industry, I suppose. Here's my own op-ed this time, based on a decent amount of feedback regarding videos like these, and really my own work experience as well, especially as a workplace safety instructor. As a society, it's kind of part of our culture. It's natural to hold the brave men and women who venture out on the oceans in high regard, and for good reason. It's also been part of our culture as society evolves to begin normalizing things like the need for seatbelts in cars, fire extinguishers in buildings, or accessible emergency exits, along with countless other topics that would have been completely taboo just a few decades ago. But when studying cases like the Northern Belle, it is striking to see how normalized these deaths still are. Like, someone's got to do it, it's unavoidable. And while there is some truth to that due to the inherent dangers Mother Nature poses, a good thought experiment is to compare it to the inherent dangers of aviation and what commercial aviation has done with aircraft stability calculations, even in cargo planes, not just those carrying passengers, or even extend that to the nature of space travel and those vehicles which have carried astronauts and cosmonauts for so many years now. These modes of transportation aren't without risk, of course, but it's unthinkable these days if errors in loading, lacking stability calculations, or years-long neglect and maintenance were to cause aerospace accidents. And when it does apply to commercial passengers, it's almost non-existent in modern times as one of the risk factors. This is intentional. Stability calculations go beyond being taken seriously now in aviation. They're simply part of the routine, fully embedded in the culture. Based on those calculations, you either have a go or no-go situation, simple as that. And the same goes for airframe maintenance, pre-flight checks, and so on. But when these incidents happen on the high seas and lives are lost, especially among seafarers, there's an almost superhuman-like idolization to it. Yes, these crews who go out in this line of work are incredibly brave. It's something I could never do personally, no doubt about it. This normalization of loss of life, though, on an industry-wide level, can help to sustain a culture of giving it all, damn the consequences. A culture where the stigma was, and sometimes still is, that it's normalized to scoff at having a working knowledge of stability needs, to deride calculations, or to skip those steps of keeping a vessel and its occupants up to date on safety gear and/or training. Pfft, they're heroes. Heroes don't need some stinking calculations. It's normalization in an industry that is thankfully getting better, albeit slowly. While in stark contrast, the rescue crews of the U.S. Coast Guard, who have literally signed up knowing full well, quote, "You have to go out, but you don't have to come back." They are signed up to make the ultimate sacrifice should it come down to it, and yet it is fully embedded in their culture and policies to perform stability calculations, train in safety procedures constantly, and keep their equipment in operational condition. Doesn't mean it's not dangerous, it very much is. But they're going out in the same conditions to not only keep themselves alive, they'll be prepared enough to keep themselves plus one, plus two, plus a whole group of others alive. The chances of survival can be increased. The men and women fishing on the high seas that make our seafood enjoyment possible, that sustain their local economies when there's literally no other commerce available, they are brave, there's no doubt about it. But I don't feel it makes them any less deserving of having their chances maximized within the limits of what's feasible, to be able to return home safely to their loved ones. So real quick, since a lot of folks have been asking lately, the music I use to back my voiceover, set the atmosphere and all that, is produced and licensed to me for use by the artist Morse. He's a music industry expert, and his typical clientele are those artists looking to make a name for themselves, like vocalists, rappers, and other similar aspiring musicians. His links will be below, and yes, most songs can be listened to without needing a license. I even listen to a lot of them when I'm out and about. His talent for ambience and dark tones, though, are something that fit uniquely in my creative process, whether he likes it or not. I'm not exactly a vocalist looking to make a name for myself in the music industry. But as with most things I do, it tends to be unique, I guess. And as many of you might know, I am very picky about the atmosphere I create in these videos, so go check them out and tell them Sam said what up. Anyway, like I stated earlier, these videos are only possible without sponsors because of so many viewers, subscribers, and especially the Immortar supporters. Especially now, since behind the scenes, Morse and I just teamed up to defeat a known copyright abuser that's been attacking the channel for a couple years now. It's not completely over, but I'll take all the wins I can get. I'll be elaborating more on this in a community post at some point later. A special shout out to those top tier Patreon supporters: Robert G, Philip B, P Rush, Paul R, Nathan F, Kenneth P, Andrew M, and Alex S. Don't forget, you're important and your safety matters.